much. Thank you so much for a very generous and warm introduction and an invitation from you, Cecilia and David, to present some new work. Over the last few years, I've been working on this idea of field social psychology, so it's really nice to have an opportunity to get it together into a new talk to present, of course, at the wonderful University of Cambridge. I'm sorry, of course, I can't be there in person, but it's nice to be able to do it in this format as well. So thanks for facilitating this talk. So this talk will have three parts. In part one, I'm going to talk about field social psychology, and I'm going to talk about three interrelated questions. What is it? Why might we need field social psychology? And how might we do field social psychology? And in part two, which is going to be the more substantive part of the talk, I'm going to give two examples of field social psychology, what I mean when I talk about field social psychology as an area of social psychology. And this is going to draw on two lines of my research that intersect. One I've been working on for almost a decade in one form or the other. This is this dynamic of protest and non-protest due to economic concerns in the Republic of Ireland. And it's based around this observation that I call the deprivation protest paradox, that when the economy in Ireland collapsed in 2008, there was little to no protests. Yet when Ireland had the fastest growing economy in Europe in 2014 and 15, then we saw these mass protests on the streets of Dublin and many other streets in the Republic of Ireland. So I'm going to look at this, this paradox from a field social psychological point of view. I'm also going to talk about another example, again involving protest, but this time motivated by concerns over climate in opposition to the Irish context. This research is in the Norwegian context with some really wonderful collaborators at the University of Oslo who did a lot of this research as well. And this work is a little bit more current. It was just published somewhat recently, a month or two ago, I believe. In part three, which is going to be the final part of this talk, I'm going to just talk a little bit more broadly about field social psychology and what it can offer for advancing and developing psychological science more broadly. I'll talk about the potential of this re-expansion of the social psychological paradigm from a field social psychological perspective. So I have a new paper forthcoming with my collaborator, my good friend, Gabriel Velez, who's an assistant professor at Marquette University in the United States. And Gabe was in comparative human development for his PhD at the same time I was there. And we've written some methodological and conceptual pieces together. And we have a forthcoming paper, hopefully it should be out very soon, in the journal American Psychologist with the title Field Social Psychology. And in this, we try to outline an agenda of what field social psychology is, some of its historical origins, some base definitions and so on, and some of the applications of what field social psychology is. So this is the definition that Gabe and I use, and I want to share it with you. We say that field social psychology is a conceptual and methodological approach to describe, examine, and explain psychological phenomena at multiple levels of analysis, with emphasis on socio-cultural environments in which people are embedded, with emphasis on the unfolding of psychological processes over time and the use of ecologically valid methods in conjunction. So there's quite a lot in that, but it's one of the most succinct formulations of field social psychology that Gabe and I could articulate. And this is how we begin this forthcoming paper on field social psychology. But over the next few slides, I want to unpack it a little bit and talk about some of its historical contextualization. So when people think about field social psychology, it might bring to mind the work from the 1930s of Kurt Lewin, who had this idea of field theory in psychology that he developed over the 1940s and into the 1950s. So from Lewin's point of view, his conceptualization of the social, cultural, political, and economic world in which people were embedded was that it's more stable and more static. He kind of subscribed to this more static ontology of social life. He also had this idea that one can generalize from these findings that are predicated primarily with an emphasis placed on experimental procedures to understand the person in the context in which they find themselves. And though at the time Lewin's thought was obviously quite groundbreaking and revolutionary and a real kind of strong proponent of field theory in this way, it differs in some fundamental ways from what Gabe and I have been talking about in our formulation of field social psychology. From our point of view, We do not see the social, cultural, political, economic worlds in which people live as being static. Rather, we see them as in process. These worlds are unfolding and people are becoming in these worlds. They're making meaning and searching for meaning and comprehension in these worlds that are always becoming in this way. So we fundamentally, from a philosophy of science point of view, have a different ontology than Lewin. Also, we think about field social psychology as giving us the ability to theorize from local knowledge obtained from particular case studies. And again, as you see, as I give my examples and as I talk a little bit more about this, that we're really talking about using ethnographic and experimental methods in conjunction and how they may or may not work to kind of more holistically understand this unfolding socio-cultural world in which we're all living. So I want to just tell you a little bit about why I started thinking about field social psychology by giving and implicitly talking about why we might need it. So I've been thinking about two problems or two crises in psychology that we've heard a lot about over the last decade. Most recently, from about 2015 or so, I've been reading a lot and thinking and keeping an eye on the unfolding of the replication crisis. And from my reading of the literature in this area and some of the debates, my view is primarily as a cultural psychologist is that the replication crisis really exposed within paradigm problems of the dominant social psychological model and approach to psychological understanding. And when one looks at the dominant responses to the replication crisis, of course, they're useful, but also I see them as being quite limited as well. We talk about, increased statistical power, increased sample sizes and so on. But it's very little talk and discourse about reimagining what social psychology can be. So this is my view of the replication crisis, that it really exposes the limitations of experimental social psychology when used in isolation to try and meaningfully understand an unfolding ontological social world. And related to the replication crisis, if we go back to about 2010, 2011, when Heinrich and his collaborators articulated the weird problem or re-articulated the weird problem. As we all know, this idea of over-reliance on Western, educated, industrial, rich and democratic people, and generalizing from this atypical sample of human life. Again, following the debates and following the unfolding of this weird problem, we can see that there's a separation of the researcher from the socio-cultural context. And for me, at least, and for my collaborator, as I said, Gabriel Velez, we see this as exposing the further limitations of the experimental methods when used in isolation. So, taken from this kind of reading of some of the contemporary crises in psychology and social psychology in particular, I see field social psychology as offering an expansion of the dominant paradigm with some utility, perhaps, to overcome these well-documented limitations of the contemporary paradigm, and to refocus social psychology on people's experiences and how they make meaning and understand the dynamic worlds in which they live. It gives us an opportunity, I think, to holistically engage with cultural similarities and also cultural differences, and allows us to think through, at least conceptually and perhaps methodologically, and engage with processes over time, how societies not only stay the same, but also how they change. And why is this important, you might ask? From my point of view, at least, a field social psychological approach allows us to comprehend and orientate towards great global challenges that we all seem to be facing. I know my colleagues and collaborators here at the University of Copenhagen, and I'm sure at the University of Cambridge, are doing research and are interested in some of the pressing global challenges of our time: COVID-19, issues to globalization and migration, social, economic inequalities, and climate change. So I think for me, these are some of the big topics that a field social psychological approach can really add to our understanding of. And today I'm going to focus a little on inequalities and climate change as the primary focus of this talk. So how might we do it, at least in a conceptual sense? What does field social psychology look like? So I tried to propose a wise or a sage model of field social psychology. It's important when one thinks about what field social psychology is, do we think about it as a model that has flexibility and synthesis between methods at its core. It's not some sort of rigid structural model that one size fits all. Rather, we argue for this combination of multiple methods to triangulate holistic understandings of people's experiences within their context. We're big advocates of spanning qualitative and quantitative methodologies and proposing how they might be used together in conjunction to really kind of fully understand the phenomenon of interest. So some of the methods that I think fall under the umbrella of field social psychology, and at least in some of my writings, I've given some expression to: naturalistic observation, participant observation, informal and semi-formal or semi-structured interviewing, and then to the more quantitative side of psychological research, field experiments and lab experiments as well. And in an earlier model, my collaborator, Gabe Velez, Ahmed Gaddafi, and Joseph Tennant, who were all at the University of Chicago, and Joe Tennant spent some time at Cambridge actually doing a postdoc there after his PhD. We developed the SAGE model of social psychological research, published in Perspectives on Psychological Science, where we argue for this kind of synthetic model where qualitative and quantitative methods are continuously informing the use of each other. We argue that qualitative methods can be seen as being augmentative to quantitative methods, that qualitative methods can be seen as being generative of new hypotheses that might be unpacked using quantitative methods, and qualitative methods in and of themselves can be used to study experiences that evade experimental reduction. So this, at least, is how we're thinking conceptually about field social psychology. But of course, things get a little bit different, and when you have to apply these types of theories and concepts and methods to the real world, when the rubber hits the road, so to speak, this is when the flexibility of these types of approaches and the fitting of them to unique contexts becomes important. And this is what I'm going to talk about a little bit in part two. So I've mentioned this research I've done in Ireland, and this research, contemporary research my collaborators and I have done in Norway. So for the Ireland project, I was really interested when I began my PhD at the University of Chicago in the global financial crisis. You know, we can think about it starting in 07, 08 with the collapse of the Lehman Brothers. In Ireland, that started to take effect in 2018. And the span of data collection in particular, from my point of view during my work, ended around 2016. So I see it as this kind of case study over this number of years that I've been working on. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what I've been doing, perhaps over the last decade or so in this Irish case study. My dominant research question when it comes to understanding protests in this Irish context, I was really interested to say something meaningful about what are people's psychological reactions to economic hardship. So when I began thinking and writing a little bit more about these dynamics of protests in Ireland, I started reading more broadly about fairness as a kind of a broad theoretical moral structure for thinking about when and why people protest in reaction to economic hardship. I'm going to say a little bit about fairness very soon. Then I'm going to briefly tell you about two qualitative studies that I did during the economic crisis in Ireland when the economy collapsed. I did interview qualitative studies with a group of elites and a group of unemployed young people. And then I did an experiment which really showed an incongruent result with the qualitative studies. So I'm going to maybe make a discussion to see and to inform you about how I was thinking about this disjunction. Then I'm going to highlight this dramatic economic change in Ireland when we move from an economic recession where people were not protesting to an economic recovery, where people began protesting when a new charge on water was introduced by the government in the context of staggering economic growth. I'm going to talk about then these protests and what I did during these protests in Ireland and from a field social psychological point of view. I'm going to give some examples of the qualitative data that I was interested in. So as I mentioned, I was interested in the psychology of fairness as a broader frame when I was writing up some of these results, and drawing on the work of Rick Schrader, my advisor, the cultural psychologist and cultural anthropologist at the University of Chicago, and his former postdoc, Jonathan Haidt, who made famous moral foundations theory. But some of you read closely the anthropological and some of this social psychological work, we see that a sense of fairness seems to be a universal moral principle. And might not just be humans who have this kind of sense of fairness and unfairness. We see evidence from biological anthropology that it seems to be fundamental across species. Paul Bloom tells us that babies are not simply babies, they are just babies in his book, in that they have a sense of right and wrong and good and bad. In the economic realm, Mike Norton and Darren Ariely, they tell us that people think economic disparities are often unfair. And then when we look at developmental evidence, experimental evidence from Shaw at the University of Chicago and collaborators, we understand that children have an ingrained sense of economic fairness from a very young age. But when it came to beginning this field, social psychological work, although I had this kind of informed curiosity and thinking about dynamics of fairness and some of this literature, really I was quite naive when I started doing this particular project. I could see when the economies around the world collapsed, that in Spain and Greece and Portugal and Italy, for example, you had mass demonstrations against governments, against those in power. There was clashes with police, for example. This lifted from a Greek protest, the background photograph. But in Ireland, there was a much more muted response, and I wanted to find out why. So I spoke to, as an initial starting point of this research project, a group of political elites in Ireland, people who are on TV, on radio, they were economists. They were really responsible for circulating ideas about the Irish general response, this passive response to economic hardship and austerity in Ireland. I conducted semi-structured interviews with these people. My questions aimed to understand the causes, consequences, and solutions to the economic recession. And I performed a thematic analysis of what they said from the transcribed interview data. And it showed three themes that I wrote about. The first being migration, the second social cohesion, and the third is provocative moral principle that in life you get what you deserve, that in life you reap what you sow. So for the purposes of this talk, I just want to focus on the reap what you sow theme. But just to say that when it comes to migration, there is this general belief that a lot of angry young people had left Ireland in 2008, and they were not physically in the island to protest against the government, against banks, and demand change in this particular way. And if we look at the past, Ireland has a long history of migration in times of economic hardship from the 1840s and the famine all the way up to the 1980s. And this was seen as a continuation and a use of this past. And a similar use of the past as well was evident when people were talking about social cohesion. These elites in Ireland, these influential media and political, economic personalities, they remember this violent version of an Irish past with the Troubles and so on. And he said, we don't solve our problems by going to the streets anymore. We're more a maturing modern democracy, and we do our bloodletting at the ballot box, was one of the memorable quotes. But taken together, these seem palatable and perhaps legitimate reasons, or at least plausible narratives of why Irish people were not protesting. But the provocative one was this idea that in life you get what you deserve, that in life you reap what you sow. So this quote is going to be from quite a famous financial advisor, economist. He's very often on TV and radio in Ireland, and it highlights the ubiquity of this discourse about getting what you deserve in Ireland. And this is why people were not protesting, because they were foolish with their money. And of course, when the economy collapsed, that they blamed themselves because they were culpable and not anybody else. And this is why you don't see people on the streets. So you can see why this might be a provocative type of argument from this group of elites who I interviewed. So he says to me, I don't think any one participant can cause what happened in this country without the implicit approval of the people in it and the tacit approval of those who were not in it. So when people say, well, I was never part of it. Well, if you are here and you are getting impressive wage rises, you are taking the benefit of it. You are just not playing the game at the table. So here is kind of like, an off the record interview, obviously totally anonymous. And then this interviewee, like many of the others, told me this reason, this idea that people were part of it. You were all kind of gambling in some way, or were all at the party, and then you suffer the consequences the next day. And regardless if you're explicitly part of the system, or that you're just implicitly part of Irish life at this time, that you contributed to the economic boom that preceded the bust, and now we're all in the bust, and we were part of it. So therefore you can't really blame anyone else. So my colleague, Dave Nussbaum, and I, Dave is at the Chicago School of Business, Booth School of Business. He and I wrote an op-ed article in the Guardian newspaper, which got an awful lot of attention for a pilot study, presenting some of these ideas. But of course, some of the dominant feedback as well is that, we talk to people, an atypical example of people, this group of elites in Ireland. What about other groups? What was going on? What was their representation? What were they thinking and feeling about the economy? So I did a follow-up study with unemployed young adults, many of whom I interviewed at job centres in Ireland. I interviewed about 20 of them. And my research illustrated this kind of somewhat surprising internalization of the reap what you sow moral principle. And I just want to give one example of the types of stories that people were telling me, these young unemployed people, predominantly young unemployed men who I spoke to in their early 20s, for example. So this guy, his name was John, let's say. He was an unemployed former carpenter when I interviewed him. So I say, who, if anyone, do you blame for the economic recession? And he says, you have to put the blame in society in general, you know what I mean? There was just no exit plan. People just kept buying and selling and giving loans. There was no expectation or realization that this was all going to break down. And when the world recession kicked in and everyone is panicking and everyone is losing jobs, no one is expecting the highlights to end so suddenly and so abruptly. So you have to put the blame on society, he says. So I push him a little further in my next question. Well, so who do you mean by society? He says the Irish public. It's not just the Irish, I guess it's a world recession. But I think we were so naive to think that we will just enjoy these moments without any plan for the future. My mother and father spent what they wanted. They got loans out and they would spend it and worry about it in the future. And over the course of the interview, he told me about his father's depression, the financial problems that his working class family are struggling with in the aftermath of these foolish, according to him, financial decisions. But it's interesting, of course, that he's not blaming the availability of these cheap loans, for example, how easily they were got without, potentially credit checks and so on. But he's really internalizing this blame that it wasn't the government or the banks, it was me and my family and decisions we made. And this is directly linked to this kind of conceptualization of not protesting in Ireland. Why would you go to the streets if one is culpable? And this idea, of course, this moral logic of in life you get what you deserve, that you reap what you sow. Of course, as you might know, some of these people in the audience who are a little bit more quantitatively or experimentally orientated, when you hear these types of qualitative analyses, you might think they're stories in some way. So a lot of my colleagues were saying, oh, why don't you try to do an experiment and to try and unpack a little bit further what's happening? Can you demonstrate this reap what you sow idea statistically? So I had a very simple hypothesis based on these two qualitative studies. So I wanted to know that when people are primed to think the actions of ordinary people caused the recession, as opposed to thinking external factors caused the recession, that they should support protests less. This hypothesis would be congruent with the qualitative findings from both the elites and the unemployed people. So I developed an ecologically valid experimental materials to test this hypothesis with my really great colleagues, Tara Mandalawala at Amherst in the United States and Aaron Kay in Duke University. So we created these two fake Irish Times news articles. One condition was the Irish to blame, where the idea of this article is that ordinary people were fiscally irresponsible, and this led to the financial crisis. And then in contrast, in the external factors condition, we have this narrative that there's a global financial crisis, that Ireland is a small open economy that was particularly vulnerable to a global downturn, and this is what caused the financial crisis. And in contrast to the qualitative research, we found that participants in the Irish to blame condition were actually more likely to support protest behaviours than those in external factors condition. So you can see this is exactly the opposite effect of what we predicted from based on the qualitative research with both the elites and with the unemployed people. So I spent a lot of time actually in the middle of my doctorate thinking about these results and what they meant. But then I reached a conclusion, at least that was satisfying for me, that at least on a social and an economic and a political level, the attitudes and ideas in Ireland were shifting from this kind of passive acceptance of austerity and blaming oneself. There seemed to be a lot more happening in Ireland And I started shifting my focus again back qualitatively to see if there was something interesting behind these quantitative findings that were reflecting broader societal changes in Ireland that one might investigate ethnographically. So here on the cover of Time magazine, you see our former Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, Enda Kenny, kind of in 2014, announcing to the world and to an American audience in particular, we had this Celtic comeback, this idea that we were sick, but we took our medicine in the form of austerity, and now we're strong again. Ireland is open for business. So this is a very omnipresent narrative in Irish media, and of course, as you can see in international media, that things were once again becoming really good in Ireland from an economic point of view. But that's not the only thing that was happening. The government also introduced a new charge on water in this context of upturn and economic growth. And these people who had been accepting economic hardship, this narrative that we're somehow all in it together, realized that they were not all in it together. Although the economic system on an aggregate was growing, people in Ireland were hit with a new charge in water. And this discrepancy, they thought, was particularly unfair. And they took to the streets. So I spent about a year going to these national demonstrations in Dublin. You have to imagine perhaps 100,000 people at some of the larger ones. I was doing random sampling, interviewing with groups of people, friends, old people, young people, and so on. And simultaneously, you had these splinter social movements in different towns and cities in Ireland. And I spent substantial time following one group around as they protested against the introduction of water tax against various authorities in this one smaller Irish city. And a lot of the discourse was around this idea of unfairness. And this one woman I spoke to at a protest, middle-aged woman from Dublin, she explained to me that there's far too much austerity on ordinary people, on ordinary working class people, and even middle-income people are being crucified with high taxation, with motor tax, petrol tax, value-added tax, everything. Everything you buy in this country, it's far too dear, it's far too expensive, she tells me. So I interviewed several hundred people over this course of years. You can imagine I have a massive amount of data. And I performed a content analysis around this idea of fairness and unfairness, and trying to explain why people were out on the streets. What was motivating them to protest at this particular point in time, having passively accepted austerity for some years with the economic collapse, only to protest during this economic recovery. Of course, as I've explained, this new charge on water was very upsetting for people. It was the drop that caused the dam to burst, for want of a better expression. As we've seen in the previous extract, people were concerned about the increased cost of living and taxes. Also, due to the economic boom, a lot of people were losing their homes in Ireland. So there's a homeless crisis, which continues to today. About the perennial problems in the health service in the Republic of Ireland. There's also a general sense when we go to these protests and we talk to people that the police are on the side of the corporations and not the public. And linking back to the experimental finding that I was struggling to make sense of from a quantitative point of view, when I interviewed these hundreds of people over the course of a year, I could see quite clearly that there's a shift in the attribution of blame. So people had initially blamed themselves for the economic crisis, this kind of narrative, perhaps stoked and steeped in Irish Catholicism of in life, you get what you deserve, you pay for your sins somehow, this reap what you sow mentality. But now it was reversed when I spoke to people in the protest. So it was the government who should reap what they sowed. They introduced this new tax on water that was very unpopular, and they should leave government, call an election, leave government and allow people to vote in a new left-leaning government was the call from the people generally at these protests. So one left-wing politician speaking to about 100,000 people in O'Connell Street in Dublin nicely summarised what was happening in Ireland when she said, "Let no one be in any doubt that our demand will be an end to water charges and to Irish water, and the beginning of a society based on equality, decency, fairness, and full citizenship for every single one of us. And that means a roof over every citizen's head, that means decent work, it means a decent chance and fair taxation." So this has kept me busy, of course, all through my PhD and postdoc, going over and back from Chicago to Ireland and figuring this out. But what lessons can we learn from the Irish case study? So I've been thinking about this. Congruent to the field social psychological approach and my point about theorizing from local knowledge, perhaps that we can say that people tolerate economic hardship even during a recession when it is considered to be fair. When economic hardship is deemed unfair, even during periods of economic growth, social movements can develop. And perhaps we can say that perceptions of what is and is not fair modulate whether people tolerate growing economic inequalities and hardship or not. And why might this be important? These kind of theoretical insights from the localized Irish case study. Well, for a start, it allows us to comprehend unfolding socio-political phenomena. We can also use these findings from local cases to understand other relevant global events. So I started extrapolating and thinking beyond the Irish case study and these types of dynamics that I was seeing in Ireland to, for example, the Occupy Wall Street protests in the United States in 2011. So it's quite interesting these protests didn't start in 2007 when the economy collapsed, yet when the economy was growing in the United States and when there's a clear divide for who was winning and who was losing, who was in the 1% and who was in the 99%. Similarly, we see it more recently in France with the yellow vests, again in the context of aggregate economic growth in France. The government introduced a new tax like they did in Ireland with water, in the French context on fuel that disproportionately hit working people. Here pictured truck drivers who wear the yellow vests as part of their job and are demonstrating and protesting against this introduction of an unfair new tax in the context of growing economic prosperity in France. We see it too in South America, in Chile, in the context of economic growth, that people are protesting when the government decided to introduce a new tax or increase the charge on subways in Chile, which is typically used by workers and students who are protesting here. And we can see similar dynamics that I was thinking about and talking about and theorizing from in Ireland in these contexts, also in the African context in Sudan, where the government increased the price of bread. And this motivated, again, in the context of economic growth, people to think that this is unfair, that they are feeling left behind, and then galvanized this protest movement. So some of these ideas of comparing your lot to others in life and feeling left behind can be understood from a theoretical point of view, from relative deprivation, which is articulated by Sam Stoffler in 1948 in these classic studies of promotion in US military. And the bare bones of relative deprivation theory state that when an individual or group compares themselves to salient or other individuals or groups and finds themselves lacking or discriminated against, this leads to angry frustration. So this is like a very useful bare bones of a theory that can be applied to many different contexts and has over the years. With my PhD student, Thomas Masson, and my collaborator, Thomas Morton, here at the University of Copenhagen, we've been thinking and we wrote a paper based on this theorizing, who compares who to whom? And using this Irish case study is kind of galvanizing this kind of theoretical development. So we write about the idea of roles of technology and globalization, of shifting people's subjective experiences in a globalized and technologically integrated world. Who is comparing who to whom becomes an important question, whether one feels comfortable or uncomfortable, discriminated against, frustrated, and so on. We also question this idea of who are the 1%. In the Irish context, the 1% were seen as the bankers or the political elite, these people who had lost a lot in the recession and gained during the economic recovery and are seen as being in the upper echelons of Irish society. But of course, we saw no comparisons down the way. And of course, we had the Syrian migration crisis in Europe around the time these protests in Dublin were happening, but not one person I interviewed spoke about people who are less fortunate than them in some particular way. For example, Syrian refugees trying to make their way into Europe. And of course, no one saw themselves globally as being part of the 1% in the Irish context, where if one is to look at aggregate wages and incomes around the world, that people who are protesting in this way would be very well off. So it's interesting to think about some of the contours of who compares who to whom. And another theoretical advancement I've been thinking about and utilizing, and we'll hear more in relation to the Norwegian context after this, is this idea of temporal comparison. Are people just comparing their lot in life to others in the present? Or are you comparing yourself to some remembered past or an imagined past? Or are people making comparisons to their future? And this, I think, is quite interesting, imagined comparisons and imagined lives. And this is something I'm working on now in various ways. This idea of the cultural psychology of imagination I find quite exciting. I also think about this idea of history and comparisons. I've been working on developing these two narratives of economic inequality. The first might be more of a left-wing narrative of inequality, this idea that the rich are getting richer, leaving us all behind. You can see here from the famous kind of graph from Thomas Piketty in his 2014 tome, that from the 70s in Western liberal democracies in Europe, you see this disjunction of those at the top are getting richer, and those, the rest of us, are being a little bit left behind. And in the English context, this is something, of course, Jeremy Corbyn would have talked about quite a lot, or in the US context, Barack Obama will talk about this increasing inequality. But there's this other narrative, if you take a longer, broader historical approach, maybe more of a conservative narrative. But if you look at from the year 1 to the year 2001 on this graph of average incomes across the world, for most of human history, people were poor. You can see this little bump around the 1500s when the British and Dutch started putting naval boats out into the oceans and capable of trading. But it was with the advent of industrialization in the UK that you see this aggregate rise in wealth generation and income. And the idea here is, of course, it's unequal, and of course there's unfairness, but in general, the aggregate rise allows people access to education, it allows them access to goods and services, and increases everyone's standard of living. So you've got these two polarized narratives here, and I've been thinking quite a lot about these as generated from the Irish field social psychological research. And I got some nice reviews from Cambridge University Press to write a book based on these two narratives. So fingers crossed this will come through somewhat soon. And I want to shift focus from the Irish protests to some new work that I've been doing with, as I said, my great collaborators at the University of Oslo, two MA students, Christian Hagstad and Anja Skega, as well as Jonas Kunst, who's a cultural psychologist, again working at the University of Oslo, who did this really interesting work from both an ethnographic point of view and then a survey quantitative point of view. They're interested in why high schoolers in Norway were protesting against inaction against climate change. The movement was called Fridays for Future, and it's inspired, of course, by the Swedish activist Greta Thunberg. And we located this project and this ethnographic work in what is sometimes referred to as the Norwegian paradox. So Norway is quite interesting because it has strong environmental ambitions to meet the terms, for example, of the Paris Agreement. But this sometimes conflicts or contrasts with its privileged position as an oil economy, and especially the privileges this has granted young people who are growing up in Norway. And put another way, that managing public policy making to sustain a robust fossil fuel industry while portraying ambitious climate leadership is sometimes known as the Norwegian paradox. So we started thinking about this. Of course, I told you about the Irish paradox, and now we have this kind of more Norwegian paradox framing some of this field social psychological work. So it led us to the question within this Norwegian context, contemporary context, how do we understand the motivations for young people to protest against inaction concerning climate change? So this is a paper that came out in the Journal of Environmental Psychology just somewhat recently, reporting two studies conducted by the first two joint authors and advised by Jonas Kunst and I as joint last authors. The first study was an ethnography with these high school protesters, and the second was a quantitative survey with a broader sample of high school students. So the first two authors on the paper did really excellent field social psychological work, participant observation and interviewing with a large number of individuals at these high school strikes in Oslo. They performed a thematic analysis on this transcribed interview material and came up with 3 overarching themes used by these protesters to explain their motivations for being on the streets and not being in school. So the discourse circulated around this idea of negotiating responsibility for climate change, this idea of timely action to save our future, this idea of imagined deprivation, and this sense of a shared identity that motivates protest in the present. So I'm going to give one piece of qualitative data to highlight each of these themes. So the first is from a young high school student who says, there are so many people to blame, but also it is difficult to just blame the older generation as well, because young people live to a large extent in the same way. It's difficult to find who is to blame. I feel it is more important to point out the problems and what we can do than to just blame people. So even at this, if I put my cultural psychology hat on, it's very different from the Irish response where blame was quite easily attributed to oneself. Here, there seems to be a nice discursive positioning from this particular respondent. And we analyze this in relation to this Norwegian paradox, where these young Norwegian people are kind of quite beneficial from the oil industry, which of course contributes to the problem of climate change. So the idea here is that a lot of the young people are saying, okay, yeah, we can point the finger at people all the time, but let's focus on the future a little bit more. Let's not get too much into these problems and paradoxes and so on. Let's just deal with the problem that's in front of us. And this links on to the second theme that we talked about, this idea of we need timely action to save our future. So this idea of imagined deprivation, and this is a nice theoretical link with the previous Irish case study and this articulation of imagining comparisons in the future. So this is something omnipresent in the discourse with these young Norwegian people. So here's this one quote, just to get a flavor of what they're talking about. She says that we are here because our whole generation is in danger of not being able to live the way we want and the way we've been raised to believe that we should live. And it is because of our older generations that have taught us how we are going to live life by destroying the planet. And then she says that when I grow up, I really want to have the life that everyone dreams of, with children and a real family. But like, I start to think that maybe it won't happen because I don't want to have kids who grow up in a world that has such extreme consequences because of what we have done now to the weather and the environment. So I think this is really nice that you can see she's looping into the future and imagining the future she might have with her children and family and so on, a future that's filled with kind of these hopes that are based on how they were taught to grow up from their own generation and from their parents' generation. And she loops back from imagining into the future. And even though the content of these imaginings are not real, the consequences are. The consequences that it motivates her to protest so she can realize this imagination into the future. And the third theme related to youth, and this idea is of a shared social identity. So a lot of the young people thought of themselves as being the future, as this kind of shared collective identity. So one of the respondents told us that many of us, referring to those high school students, we can't vote, but we stand here trying to fight for climate without having any real power. Because even if they say that the youth is the future, they won't listen to us. That is a problem. As a youth, I feel a little trapped, as a respondent. So this idea of a shared identity was very ubiquitous across all the discourse from these young people. They spoke about us being together and define themselves as the youth and as the future. So this idea of shared collective identity is important. So again, like the Irish case study, we wanted to perhaps unpack some of the associations and some of the motivations for protest using some qualitative methods, or some quantitative methods. So we asked that could the concepts identified in study 1 statistically explain protest participation in combination with a very dominant model of protest, the social identity model of collective action, the SIMCA. So these students, the first authors on the paper, did a wonderful job going into high schools and got a whole bunch of participants to fill out surveys related to some of the themes and some of the insights generated from the qualitative research. And they were really trying to add theoretically to SIMCAS, the social identity model of social change, and some of the ideas that we found that were at least statistically significant and that associated with future protest intentions: informed group identification, collective guilt, environmental threat, and political orientation as well. So we added from our qualitative ethnographic work some factors and some processes that extend the boundaries of the social identity model of collective action, and helped us understand perhaps a little bit more in depth future protest intentions, not just of these young people in Norwegian context, but perhaps more generally across different contexts and future protests yet to happen. We found that politicized social identity, this idea of environmental threat, and a shared responsibility expressed in our terms in the model as collective guilt, acted as an important aspect of young people's decisions to participate in this environmental protest. But more broadly, and from my point of view, from the point of view of a field social psychological advocate, I would say this project with an ethnographic study followed by quantitative surveys with a broader sample of people illustrates the ways in which ethnographic research can inform survey studies, of course, and develop empirical insights, but also advance theory, and in this case, social identity theory, in the particular context of the Norwegian study. And just briefly, before I end, I just want to revisit the idea of field social psychology and just touch on some topics that might serve as an introduction to the question and answer section, to talk about the potential of field social psychology as re-expanding the social psychological paradigm. So I hope that you could see some insights from my talk on the theory generation and elaboration from a field social psychological perspective in the Irish case and the Norwegian case. So in the Irish case, I started unpacking the cultural psychology of moral thinking within the localized context, with a particular focus on this reap what you sow moral principle. You can see when I talked about extending relative deprivation theory from these local case studies, and also social identity theory from the Norwegian case, that it offers an expansion and elaboration of both of these theories that can hopefully be generative for future social psychologists to investigate more. I think, and I would hope, that I've made some arguments about the potential for methodological integration, the flexibility of using ecologically valid methods, looking at unfolding processes over time, can become one way in which to do cool social psychological research that is useful. From an empirical point of view, of course, my own research, or this strand of my own research, looks at the dynamic of protests in both economic, neoliberal, and climate contexts. So perhaps we've learned something in and of itself useful about the Irish and the Norwegian context. And for me, as I said, this paper is yet to come out, and this idea of field social psychology has yet to be presented beyond the current presentation right here to a broader audience. But for me, I like to think about it as re-expanding the social psychological paradigm. And I would like to see people creatively engage in trying to tackle some of these pressing global issues. So with that, I will end, and I will thank you so much for your wonderful attention and for the wonderful invitation. So thank you so much.